What's up guys, and welcome back to GetPsyched. Now we took a little bit of time away, a couple of other projects going on, a little bit busy in this, but it's really good to be back to bring you some new video content. And today we're going to be taking a look at overcoming self-criticism, and we're going to be using some concepts from compassion-focused therapy, so make sure to stay tuned right to the end. Don't forget guys, as always, if you are enjoying today's video and if you're enjoying GetPsyched content as a whole, then you can subscribe to us and you can hit that little bell next to the subscribe button and you'll get weekly reminders every time we upload. And if you're enjoying today's video as well, make sure to hit the like button and you can comment on the video as well and I'll be sure to get back to you. Anyway, like I said, today we're going to be looking at overcoming self-criticism using concepts from compassion-focused therapy. But what exactly is compassion-focused therapy? Compassion-focused therapy is fundamentally a third wave form of cognitive behavioral therapy, and that means a couple of things. It utilizes concepts such as acceptance, compassion of course, and also mindfulness. CFT focuses on exhibiting compassion for yourself and for others in order to reduce symptoms, cognitive thoughts, and behaviors that can add to distress. Now, I think personally CFT is one of the best modes of therapy or one of the best theoretical frameworks to look at self-criticism from, because so often, as you could expect, people with high self-criticism lack any real form of self-compassion. So concepts from CFT can be really helpful in overcoming self-criticism. CFT argues that we have three main systems of operation: the threat system, the drive system, and the soothe system. And it argues that over the course of human history, all of these systems were utilized pretty effectively in order for us to function. They were also used in order for us to survive, but in today's present world, we use some of those systems more than we need to. Primarily the threat and the drive system are systems that we kind of overuse, and we forget often to utilize that soothe system in order to obtain our wants and desires. CFT helps us to bring those systems into balance and also to utilize that soothe system a little bit more. Okay, so now we have a little bit more of an understanding on what compassion-focused therapy is. Let's take a look at self-criticism. And the first question that we have to answer in order to overcome self-criticism is answer the question why people are so self-critical. Self-criticism is basically a harsh and unfair judgment of the self. People with really high self-criticism can often be very afraid of rejection or failure, and as a result exhibit self-critical stances in order to avoid failure or rejection. And I see this in clients now and again where high self-criticism often is correlated with that fear of rejection and failure, because if I'm super self-critical and if I'm constantly checking in with myself and beating myself up for certain things, and it helps, well, the theory goes, it helps to equip me to avoid situations where I might be rejected or I might fail. Now, of course, that doesn't always work, and actually that self-critical nature can do more harm than good. Now, self-criticism can fundamentally come from a number of different avenues, and often when I talk about these kind of things on GetPsyched, I'm always really cautious because these things are so subjective. But high self-criticism often is very correlated to poor developmental relationships that we've had growing up. Now, not trying to sound too much like Sigmund Freud here, but if we haven't had close attachments growing up, then often we can see correlations of self-criticism in adulthood. Additionally, traumatic experiences and also childhood bullying and things like persecution and humiliation growing up, these are the kind of things that can contribute to high self-criticism. Now, I'm not saying that everybody with high self-criticism has experiences of those things, or everybody who has experiences of those things go on to develop self-criticism. These things are, of course, subjective, and I'm just giving you a little bit of a taste of some of the ways that self-criticism can perpetuate for people. So why then do we exhibit high self-criticism at times? One of the theories about why we exhibit really high self-criticism at points, because we all experience high self-criticism, some people much more than others, one of those theories is that we internalize the external perceptions of caregivers in order to function. So for example, maybe we had parents or caregivers who were very critical, and in order to get things done or in order for us to function, we felt that we had to experience some form of criticism to kind of keep us in check. And as we grow up, as we get into adulthood, that external criticism doesn't so much come from external caregivers anymore, and so we internalize those self-criticisms because we think we need that to function. And I think that makes sense to some degree. We live in a society that, tells you that you're doing something wrong, It tells you that you need to do better, it tells you to stop doing certain things, and of course there's a place for that. But what can happen is if that is really severe, or if that's kind of over the top perhaps, when we grow up we have less of that externally, and we feel like we need that in order to develop, in order to function. And so when we have less of that, we feel like it's the only thing that helps us function, and so we internalize it. We become self-critical because we think we need it. There's also theories that stipulate that if I develop high self-criticism, it could actually be as a mechanism to stop external criticism. Let's look at an example. If my father is really critical to me in my behavior or the way I operate, if I exhibit really intense internal self-criticism, then maybe he'll back off. Now that's of course a theory that's up for debate, but it's one of the theories that has developed over time that argues why people can become so self-critical. It actually in some ways could serve a self-protective nature. That theory also develops and says that if I am so self-critical and I punish myself really severely, then that external criticism actually hurts less. And we often see this in young children growing up into adolescence and adulthood as well, who have experienced really intense bullying growing up. Sometimes that self-critical nature can actually provide a protective stance. And if I beat myself up so much, if I'm so self-critical and I say some horrible things to myself and about myself and think horrible things about myself, then that external criticism really doesn't hurt as much. Again, we come back to this theory that self-criticism actually serves a kind of protective role. Plato and Aristotle actually argued that forms of self-criticism can be functional and helpful in order to check in with the limitations of our character and functionality. And there's actually a place to be said about that. We have to be able to be self-critical to some degree in order to check in with limitations that we maybe have, or weaknesses or areas for improvement. That's of course appropriate. But what can happen is people utilize the forms of self-criticism too intensely, and it can become more detrimental than positive. So we understand a little bit more about CFT, compassion focused therapy, and also what self-criticism is and why we do it. But how do the two combine? How can CFT help us overcome some of our self-criticism? Well, CFT often talks about developing a fuller understanding of the issues that we're facing. So CFT might say it's important for us to acknowledge and understand where our self-criticism comes from. Now that's of course utilized in many forms of therapy, and it's really, really appropriate. We have to understand what function that self-criticism is serving. And often when we develop discussions around actually your self-criticism is trying to provide a protective role for you, we can start to see that the self-criticism is trying to serve a positive purpose, but in a pretty clumsy way. It also helps with something else that often happens with self-criticism, is that people can become self-critical because they're self-critical. So they can utilize those self-critical skills in order to overcome their self-criticism, and we don't want that to happen. And CFT wants that to stop happening. So actually acknowledging what our self-criticism is about and the positive role that the self-criticism is trying to serve can be a really functional way in starting to reduce that self-criticism from a CFT standpoint. One of the key concepts of CFT is about building a better relationship with yourself. And that's really the case when it comes to self-criticism. CFT might actually say, okay, in order to manage your self-criticism better, we need to understand the emotions that are underneath it. You know, our self-criticism can be fueled by loneliness or sadness or anger or fear, maybe even. Emotions that we need to manage and nurture and improve and help support a little bit better. So actually understanding the deeper levels of emotion underneath the self-criticism is one of the key concepts of CFT that can help manage self-criticism. Ultimately, compassion-focused therapy wants us in some way to kind of critically assess our self-criticism. Rather than trying to repress it, rather than trying to beat it up, which would be utilizing things like the Thrive and the Drive systems in order to overcome our self-criticism, we want to utilize some of those soothe system mechanisms in order to overcome the self-criticism. And that comes in the form sometimes of critically assessing what our self-criticism is all about, and if there's better ways to manage the emotions that are deeper underneath the self-criticism, things like fear and loneliness and sadness. Perhaps there's a more soothing, more compassionate way of managing those emotions than just being so self-critical all the time, because it's really not been getting us very far. So again, that's where the CFT concepts come in that can really help manage self-criticism. One of the other ways in which I utilize compassion-focused therapeutic principles for self-criticism is by putting ourselves in a third person's shoes. You know, showing more compassion to ourselves fundamentally can come by looking at things through a third person. What would this interaction look like from another party? you know, this relationship that you have with yourself, the way that you're talking to yourself, the things you're saying, what would that look like if a bystander was passing by and heard these things? Also, are these the kind of things that you would use, or are these the kind of words that you would use to talk to someone else? And would you say these things to someone else? You probably wouldn't. And what would it feel like for someone else to say those things to you? I can imagine they'd feel really hurtful, so why are you saying them to yourself? It's about showing fundamentally more compassion in order to manage those self-critical stances. Okay guys, thank you so much for watching this week's episode of GetPsyched. This week we've been looking at overcoming self-criticism. Again guys, if you've been enjoying this week's video, then you can like the video, you can also comment on the video and I'll be sure to get back to you. And if you're enjoying GetPsyched as a whole, then make sure to subscribe to us and you can hit that little bell next to the subscribe button and you'll get weekly reminders every time we upload. Thanks again for watching guys, and hopefully catch you next week.